Welcome to the Turboville Speaker Series. We're so glad that just said to those of you who are sitting around the room with us, and welcome to those of you who are joining us by Zoom. And we hope that you come back to see our other Turboville Speaker Series events this semester. Today, of course, you are here to see the slide that I'm not able to advance to. There we go. You came here to hear Dr. Demps talk about her work. Before we get to that, I do want to cover a little more information. First of all, for those of us who are sitting here, I do want to share the official land acknowledgement of the University of Arizona that was developed in partnership with tribal communities in Arizona. We respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. Here at the Francis McClelland Institute, our goal is to use the power of research to move beyond university walls to promote the well-being of children, youth, and families from marginalized backgrounds and communities. We do this by supporting innovative research, actively partnering with community organizations, sharing research findings with practitioners and the community, and educating the next generation of engaged scholars and leaders. All of the work that we do is to honor the legacy of Francis McClelland, who lived a life that demonstrated, facilitated, and celebrated resilience. Francis was a generous and tireless advocate for children, women, youth, and families, especially those who experienced injustice and adversity. We're also very happy to honor another alum who makes the speaker series possible, Pam Turboville, who is integral to many of the activities that we do at the Francis McClelland Institute, as well as the Norton School of Human Ecology. I am thrilled to welcome our first speaker of the Spring Turboville Speaker Series, Dr. Dawn Demps, who is joining, and we're also going to do a quick slide change, who is joining us from the College of Education. Dr. Demps, and we're going to switch chairs too, is a Flint, Michigan native who has been involved with community advocacy and organizing for over 25 years. In her community efforts, she utilizes her own lived experiences to connect with students and parents to promote tools for self-advocacy and structural reforms, and strives to champion the concerns of these populations. Dr. Demps holds a master's in social justice studies from Marygrove College in Detroit, Michigan, and received her PhD from Arizona State University in education policy and evaluation. She is currently an assistant professor at the University of Arizona's College of Education and Education Policy Studies and Practice. Her research focuses on historical and contemporary policies and practices that contribute to the educational pushout of racialized populations. She further interrogates the way those populations resist such exclusionary efforts to advocate for policy change and work towards the creation of inclusive futures. From this work, she queries how we have come to determine and define who are educational leaders. Dr. Demps has a number of awards. I'm just going to briefly mention one. She was the 2020-2021 American Association of University Women Fellow Award winner. So we are very pleased to have her here. We are navigating the hybrid format perspective here. And I do just want to add, is really to highlight research that reflects community engagement and or strengths-based approaches to marginalized communities, and Dr. Demps' work adamantly checks both boxes, and you'll hear this as she talks about the power of her scholarship. So thank you for joining us, and hopefully we've smoothed out the technology bumps. We don't.
Yeah. So he'll have a minute. So that's partially my fault. So usually I'm a person who presents standing and moving around, and when I found out that there was the option to be live in front of people, I jumped on it like, yes, I want to do this in front of people. Didn't realize it was going to be hybrid. So I've never done it like this before. So I was like, oh, I don't know if I should stand. I don't want to stand in front of the slides, but I was like, oh, they could still see me. So I do want to stand. So all that to say, I am an energy person, and for the people online as well, I will take questions at the end, but I do appreciate comments throughout. If you want to, post comments in the chat section. In terms of the people here, nod your head, shake your head, like, no, I disagree, or whatever. Yes, hallelujah, or whatever. My background, I come from the tradition of the Black church and the griot tradition from Africa. And so I really feed off of what the audience is telling me, and it also informs, which is connected to my work, right? I do community informed work, which means I'm listening to what the people are saying, and it does have an impact to how it is I will look at it, because I think they highlight things that we may be missing, and a lot of times we're missing a lot. So my name is Dawn Demps, and I just want to say thank you, first of all, to McClellan and Dr. Pamela Tuberville for having me here, and for this series, which is very interesting. And I love that you're looking at community engaged research and how it is we do that, and how that it moves us forward in the work that we're doing, especially around families, youth, and young people and communities. So I am a mommy of 3 beautiful children. And so I identify as 3 overarching type of themes in my life that do impact my research. The first thing is that I am a mother, but not just a mother of natural children, but what we call community mothers in the work. In Black feminist scholarship, they talk about other mothering, which we'll talk about a little bit further in my research, and community mothers. The next thing that I consider myself as is a bridge. So my background is in community building and organizing. That's how I was trained up. I'm from Flint, Michigan. I hung around a lot of elder community mothers and aunties who taught me how it is we go about making change in our community, how it is sometimes you got to have breakfast with the politician you might not like, how it is you knock on door to door to get people to come because people like face-to-face interaction. Thus, I like face-to-face interaction, right? I also consider myself an interrupter, which means when I am in spaces, especially where I see something unjust is happening or inequitable or inaccessible to certain particular populations that historically are marginalized, I interrupt that with my voice and sometimes with our bodies in whatever way I can. That is one of my goals, to do that. And last but not least, as a scholar, and scholar is last, not because it's the last of my considerations, but those other 3 things inform my scholarship. And so in turn, my scholarship is in service to those other 3 things. So that is a little bit about me. My youngest is 10, my oldest is 20, and my son, who's the middling, he's 18. And you will hear a little bit more about him very soon. So this is, you see charges. And this was for my son when he was 15. So in my research, I do ethnographic work. Again, I'll talk about it a little bit more, but this is from an autoethnographic piece inspired from my dissertation. While I was writing my dissertation, I kept copious notes and journals during the same time. And just so happened, ironically, this thing happened while I was doing my dissertation work. So if you see here, he's 15, he was 5'11". They had him charted at 210 pounds, and he had 2 offenses. And I was trying to figure out, how did we get here? Well, at the end of December, before winter break, the principal from Jay's high school called and told me that Jay was being suspended for smoking a vape pen in the boys' bathroom. So many things were flying in my head. How did he get the vape pen? How long would he be suspended? What is my appropriate response to my son? The principal began when I first walked in the door. Jay's never been a problem. This is unfortunately his first time ever being in my office. The principal went on to tell me how Jay was found in the bathroom with 10 other boys, but all the other boys ran out and Jay was the only one left in the stall. I turned to Jay and said, "Did you in fact have the vape pen?" He said, "Yes, ma'am." There was silence. I turned back to the principal and the principal continued. "This is a mandatory 10-day out of school suspension. We could possibly count today as day one, and I interrupted him. And I said, guess what? It is so funny. But do you know what I'm going to school for? And he seemed uncomfortable. He said, well, no. It just so happens I'm working on my PhD in education, studying this exact same phenomenon. You know, the push out of students from schools and of all the people in your office, right? That's something. I take out my cell phone that I had looked at to find the student handbook and scanned over what they talked about were necessary amendments to suspension. I learned this little trick during my ACBM Know Your Rights training that I had participated in and observed during my ethnographic work. They always told us, go through that student handbook and know it. It is boring as hell, but you need to know it and use it in your favor. Your handbook actually says that this suspension is to the discretion and consideration of other factors, like students being in danger to your campus, how long they should be suspended. Now, I will not argue with you that Jay does need some sort of a consequence for what he did. But you told me when I first walked in here yourself, this is your first time ever seeing him in your office. All his teachers like him, so I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to push back on that 10-day suspension thing. The principal looked down. Okay, well, I guess I could cut it down to 5 days out and possibly 5 days in school suspension. And I said, well, what about him missing work? He said, I will make sure that teachers get him a packet together, but he will have to take part of our drug diversion program. The principal motions for someone to come into the office, and a police officer walks in and stands next to the principal's desk. This is Officer Hernandez, and he is our SRO. He runs our drug diversion program. The officer shakes my hand and explains, it is a series of classes he will take, and when he is done, we will not pursue prosecuting him. What do you mean prosecuting him? Well, for illegal drug use in the school, if he completes the diversion program, there will be no further action on the part of the school. I respond, well, do you even actually know what was in the pen? Well, no, but we will get it tested. This all sounded like a lot of judicial talk for a first time ever being in my office student caught smoking in the bathroom. Was it possible they could really bring charges against my son? When we get home, I give Jay every form of punishment I could think of. He has dishes for 3 months. I take away his cell phone for as long as I feel that he needs it taken away. I preach to him 13 different versions of the same talk. I make him walk 2 miles every morning before school. And every time he comes back, I'm still fussing. You should not have done what you did. Peep how all your other friends who were in the bathroom with you all got out, but you got caught holding the bag. You stuck with this mess. Jay, this is the society we live in. You cannot be caught making those type of mistakes because they waiting to gobble you up whole, waiting for you to get out the stall, waiting to put you out of school. You cannot afford bad decisions, Jay. They can cost you everything. I am sure I sounded like a mad woman to my son. I just desperately needed him to understand that he can't be a kid anymore. I felt like it was psychologically abusive, developmentally inappropriate, but sadistically necessary. On February 23rd, Ahmaud Arbery was murdered while taking a jog. The next day, on February 24th, I started getting up in the morning and following Jay in my car as he did his punishment jog. Later, Jay told me that he believed I was following him in my car to make sure he did the assigned distance. I wish it were so innocent. February 28th, I received a notice to appear in the mail from the police department. And it was from the Superior Court. And it said that Jay must admit responsibility for the offense in order to participate in the diversion program. This whole situation occurred before Christmas, and I'm just receiving this follow-up. Additionally, this didn't seem like the classroom diversion program like I had been led to believe it would be. He had to report to a probation officer. I realized this was a whole different ballgame. And I called Ms. Dotson from ACBM to see if I could meet with her at the next meeting. I take Jay and me to the next meeting and bring the letter I had gotten from Superior Court. She sits down with us after the meeting and she says, Dawn, why didn't you tell me about this situation earlier? I thought I could handle it, I told her. But in my head, I added, I was ashamed, I was embarrassed, even with these women whom I knew would not judge me and had seen it all before. But fear ended up superseding all pride when I realized that they were really trying to catch my son up in the judicial system. Ms. Thames said, don't ever do that again. You should have told us about this back in December. You don't have to walk through this alone. You need to take notes for your meeting with the probation officer. We'll see if Shannon can go with you, but just in case, write down these things. They told me some questions I should ask the probation officer. They direct me to pick up a police report. I didn't even think about there being a police report. Ms. Thames said if they have charges, they have assigned him a probation officer, there's definitely a police report. They also offer to pay the $50 fee that I am being charged to put Jay in the diversion program. They give Jay a good talking to, a much gentler version of the same talk I had given him multiple times in the last 3 months. They hug us both and we leave. When we get home, I go to my bedroom, I close the door and I cry. The day of the meeting arrives and we drive to the juvenile detention center in silence. I remember I kept looking over at him while I was driving. He had on khaki shorts and a dark gray polo. His untamed hair was saying what he couldn't, what he wasn't. His knobby knees caught my attention. I decided to make use of that for small talk. Did you put lotion on, honey? Yeah, Nana bought me some, he said, thinking of his sensitive eczema-prone skin that he has had to deal with since he was a baby. I'm gonna have to get you some more Eucerin, and he nods in agreement. Another long hallway of quiet. I tap his knee, my voice shaking, almost to tears. Mama's just scared for you, okay? My eyes well up and Jay grabs my hand. I know, Mama. More silence. After a couple minutes, Jay notes as I wipe tears from my eyes, but Mama, can you keep your hands on the steering wheel so we can be safe? We both bust out laughing and Jay had successfully broken the tension until we pull up to the detention center parking lot. We silently pull in. We head to the building where the security officer takes my purse and we walk through metal detectors. We're directed upstairs to wait for the probation officer. Jay sets his head down on the table as we wait to be called in. We are eventually called in to see Officer Jody. She makes it clear that Jay must complete all these particular steps in the diversion program to avoid being sent before a judge to have a trial. The plan included the following steps: weekly drug tests, completing an 8-hour drug education class with other drug users who were adults at the detention center, write an essay on life goals and attend 12-step meetings, again, with adults who are also drug users. I myself had to complete a parenting class because, of course, I must need a parenting class. During this time, if he does anything wrong, all bets are off and he will be sent before the judge. I heard a story some time ago discussing the trick of the eyes, or maybe the mind, that makes us see things of what is actually not there. Like our ability to see cloud castles out of clouds in the sky, or Jesus in a piece of toast. This tendency to incorrectly perceive of what is right before our eyes is known as pareidolia. It is normally a perfectly innocuous natural occurrence. But what if the imaginings are always monsters? I think often of how my son is perceived by those around us. Do these optic manipulations bring some sort of twisted comfort to the observer, like how an officer can see a child 50 pounds larger than he actually is, though he is trained to know otherwise? The murderers of Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, Eric Garner, Botham Jean, and George Floyd described their victims as scary, monstrous, even demons in some way. How society may perceive of my son brings me nightmares, a constant worry that today may be the day his innocent misstep ends very poorly for him. That instead of my sweet boy who brings me breakfast in bed and makes sure that I had a break from working to eat a meal, they will see a tall Black abomination that must be locked away or killed. I imagine these are normal thoughts for the mothers of Black children, but it should not be this way. We have grown accustomed to adapting to this type of suffering, living with this ominous fear, like the talk we all have in some form or another with all of our babies. This persistent cloud of foreboding is psychotic trauma for survival on repeat, a 12-inch vinyl skipping over the same scratch in the song, yet we can't put on a new album. We don't hold the records. Black mothers must hold one image in each hand of their children. We must grasp how they are seen by the world in one hand, and in the other, we must hold tightly to who they actually are. We can never let loose of either hand, lest we are caught unprepared for what always comes. We must love them hard and press them harder. So that is just one piece. I have so much more because the story continues, but we don't have time today. I'll jump to the end. I ended up putting my son back in public school when I moved out here to Tucson. This happened when I was still in the Phoenix area doing my PhD program. I put him in school, and the school that I put him in, within the first week of him attending school, all of the athletic coaches pulled him out of class to talk to him about playing basketball or playing football. My son, who is 6'1", and by then he had probably gained a little bit of weight, probably was about 170 at that point, had never played football a day in his life. He played basketball when he was in 6th grade and didn't like it, but they kept pushing him and letting him and buying him lunch and trying to encourage him. And eventually he did join the football team, but it only lasted 2 weeks. And he told me he joined because that's where all the other Black kids in the school were, because they weren't in any other of his classes. I pulled him out again. And I decided to finish up homeschooling him. And so last year, my son graduated. We had a public ceremony and he defended his diploma publicly for all to see. But unfortunately, that is not something that all mothers have accessible to them. Because I work in academia, because I was a PhD student living off of fellowships, I was able to bring my son to work every day, to have him sit in my office. He had access to the college libraries that I was at, and I could give him assignments, and I knew how to work Google Classroom. I had all of these tools that the average mother, much less Black or marginalized mother, does not have at their fingertips. My dissertation was following a group of Black mothers that we will call the Aurora Coalition of Black Mothers, or ACBM, from Star City in the Southwest United States. They focused on equity, diversion, and inclusion. They coordinated trainings for the community, and they have been featured on the local news, even on national news, and have attracted some organized pushback from parents opposed to their conversations about equity. So before I go to my research questions for this study, the reason that this group of women came together is they were inspired by the shootings that were happening nationally, but also in Star City. And Star City had some of the highest rates of unarmed police shootings of civilians in the country for 3 years in a row, this particular city. And so the mothers came together and said, how can we fight this? How can we push back on this? And they focused on a number of things. They had like a political action arm, they had a prayer warriors arm, and then education. And their education component decided that we're going to focus on the school to prison pipeline, because we noticed the disparity between students who are pushed out that are Black or African American with their white peers and counterparts. And like the national numbers in Star City, it was about 3.5% to 4% greater likelihood that Black and brown students would be suspended. So my two overarching questions for my research working with these mothers is, how does the mother's standpoint affect their collective response to school system inequities? So standpoint, again, coming from feminist theory and Black feminist theory as well, is how do their experiences, their own personal experiences, their life experiences influence how they see and view the world, right? So how does their standpoint do that? And how have the efforts of this organizing group, ACBM, at the end of the day, influenced educational policy? Have they been effective? Have they not been effective? Why have they been effective? What have been the barriers? So these were my two overarching questions for this research. A little bit of background, because it is necessary to understand where it is I'm going to take you with this talk. When I first was preparing to come to you all. Of course, I was going to talk about my dissertation, but it was going to be more of a focus on respecting voices and data and how we do that. But there have been some things that have been happening on the ground and nationally around education that have been in the news, and I wanted to bring those things in and connect them to the research that I have done. And because all things being equal, if somebody else would pay for me to get a PhD, I probably would have a PhD in history. Wink, wink. But I have one in education. So I'm always keen to connect things that we see, especially in policy, with their historical analysis. Some people will call that critical race theory, but don't say that out loud, because really that's what it is. But we could talk about that later. So some of the things that when we look at the inception of the United States of America, when the first Africans came over here and were brought enslaved on ships, there was a rebellion called the Stoner Rebellion in 1739 in South Carolina that had a large, well, relatively speaking, right, of victims. When the people who were agitating, led by an African slave who had the ability to read and write, and he had passed notes to other people on other Black folks on other plantations to organize the Stoner Rebellion. Once it was realized that this was who the leader was, they said, we have to stop this, we have to interrupt this. And so this is where you start to see the beginnings of laws in terms of the original 13 against reading and writing. So before, they didn't really want them to read, but they did want them to read the Bible. But writing, they said, oh, we definitely can't have them writing because now they can send notes to each other, so we can't have that. And so they came up with compulsory learning laws back then, and other states followed after South Carolina. So we move all the way up to the 1950s, where we have the Defense of Brown v. Board of Education, which we are familiar with. Brown v. Board had two decisions. The first decision did not empower individuals in the states. They were not moving to actually integrate the schools, and were doing such things like shutting down whole school districts. Rather than allow Black students to go to school with white students, they would just shut down the school and open up private schools that only white students can afford to, and then the Black students were left with no schools at all. So then we had a second Brown v. Board ruling, which now we start bringing in things like busing and other things that said, okay, you have to do this, and we're going to check in. And Tucson was under this order until this past year because of their insistence on not following the ruling. So was Flint, Michigan, had very creative ways of getting around the ruling that looked very much on the surface as if they were attempts at integration, but really they were created to still keep students separate, such as community schools that people often talk about. You can ask me about that afterwards. And then schools that cites as of Black suffering. So Michael Dumas, Bettina Love, those scholars talk a lot about in present day, how we've gone beyond just the school to prison pipeline, but school as a site of suffering, or the school to prison nexus overall, this idea that institutions of learning either exclude students of color or treat them so poorly that they almost want to be excluded, right? School is not seen as a positive thing, or it doesn't have a positive impact on students, and a lot of them are meant to suffer silently. Really quick, the three types of response to these things happening that I found in the literature that mothers push back with was racial socialization. So let's just look at my piece that I talk about, and I can point out some things in the research later. What we call accommodation, or things like the talk, right? It's teaching our young people or teaching somebody else how to survive, but not push back against the system. Do exactly what you need to do because we just want you to get through, right? We just want you to live. We just want you to make it to school. We want you to make it to graduation. So don't say anything. Be the best so they don't pick on you, right? So we have racial socialization. That is a form of resistance. Racial protectionism, which is where you have parents pulling out, or their students pulling out, or students themselves pulling out. And that, again, can happen in a number of ways. It's not just leaving the school system wholesale, but we see steps. We see parents leaving public schools to go to charter schools because they believe the charter schools will be better than the public school, not just academically, but in the ways that they treat their children. Then they get there and realize there's not any better there, and they say, okay, let's go to this other school, or let's homeschool. So those are all types of racial protectionism that we might see in the school system. And then organizing, which we're familiar with organizing, where we get folks together and we work together to try to change the system, try to change policies and change the way that the system moves and operates. This is the boring stuff, but this is just to show you, not boring, but I know we have time, who the mothers were that participated in my study. I selected the mothers had to self-identify as Black or African American. So the names that they put for how they identified is how they self-identified. You see their ages. The average age of the mothers in my study were 52. And you see right here, we have all types of, we have some mothers that made over $100,000, still going through exactly what my situation was, right? And we have some that 20 to 35, right? Collect food stamps and live in Section 8, all that other stuff. So this group was comprised of all these type of mothers working together. I also interviewed community members to get an idea of how they felt about ACBM, how they looked at their organizing efforts. So the interesting thing I want to bring up is when I did this study, it was never intended to only talk to Black community members. That was not how it was intended. As a matter of fact, I didn't think that it would be most useful. I wanted to talk to a wide swath of community members. But what I found is none of the superintendents, none of the white superintendents would speak to me. None of the white, not a single white board member would speak to me and told me things like, oh, it was against their laws or they couldn't do it. Meanwhile, I was able to get Black superintendents and Black board members to do that. So that was just really interesting how difficult it was for me to get them to even speak to me about ACBM. So I'm going to go over the findings from my study. So in terms of the first research question, how does the mother's standpoint affect how it is they approach changing the school system? There were two things that I found the ACBM really focused on, and it was transformation and evacuation. This is not to say that they did not engage in racial socialization, they did, but these were the two that really came to the top, that they really were most salient in the data. In terms of the policy influence, I found two options that I called authentic change from school systems and conciliatory change. So when we talk about transformation, these are some of the things that the mother said. Well, I and my children are products of public school. I am a product of public school system, and I believe in the public school system. But back then we had dedicated teachers. And so that's just the premise that I'm coming from. More and more, I'm kind of getting a little disillusioned, but I just believe in the public school system. I think it's better for people in general to learn how to get along with all people. I just believe in public schools, and that's why I'm not a proponent of pulling our kids out of school. And this is from Cubby, who was the ACBM mother. She was in her 60s, early 70s. She was in the area when they were still segregated, and she remembers them desegregating parts of Star City. She was originally from Star City, one of the few mothers who originally was from Star City. The next mother, Simone, was younger, in her 40s, early 40s. She said there's not been exclusion, there's not been equity. It's not ever been a place for us to be comfortable because it wasn't built for us. So there's nothing we can do about that, you know? I think we just make sure that while we're in this space, because we need to be in this space, that we're not being treated wrong, that our students are not being treated wrong, but we have to, I think, really look at it from the aspect that this was not built for us. And it was never going to be inclusive. You know, so just my own experience growing and going to school, I never felt included in any way. So we have two disconnected but related comments. And just a little bit, I told you a little bit about Cubby, But Simone had experienced push out in her own experiences, whereas Cubby didn't. She still went to segregated schools when she was younger. And even when the schools were integrated, because she was from Star City and Star City was under a desegregation order because they had to be watched because they hadn't done it properly, she still largely went to schools that were segregated for the most of her young life, whereas Simone did not. And she had experienced extreme racism in her interactions with the schools and missed out on a lot of what she believed were experiences that she should have had, like to be in gifted programs and that sort of thing. And then she had her own daughter who had a lot of trauma in the school system. And she had pulled her daughter out of the public schools and put her in a charter school at the time of our interview. One of the things that I did for my study, I had a myriad of data collection formulas. I did the autoethnography, the autoethnographic term that you heard at the beginning. I did in-depth interviews, 3 in-depth interviews with each of the mothers, on top of the fact I had done 1.5 years worth of pre-field work before I followed them for 13 months once my IRB was approved. So I was with them for 2.5, almost 3 years, working with these women. Part of what they did is they also created artistic expression pieces, what I called artistic expression pieces, because I have found that, especially with adults, they tend to shy up when you ask them to do artwork. So you have to have like a more broad swath of things for them to do. So they're more likely to want to write poetry than to create an artwork, right? And so I have to allow for that and understand that. That could be a whole nother piece of research, why as adults we clam up when it comes to art. They all wanted to be professional artists. I was like, I know you're not, that's fine. But Akua, who was one of the mothers, this was the piece that she created. And Akua's background was her father was like a freedom fighter from the continent and had moved to Canada and when she was young with her family, and then she moved here to the States. So she really had a strong sense of the freedom struggle, both on the continent of Africa and here in the United States. And here in her piece, we see that she talks about her collage that she created. I asked the mothers after they did their artwork to interpret it, so it's not just me saying what I think, that there's a strained relationship between her and the education system, but she knows that knowledge is necessary. You see the picture she has, it's probably hard to see here, of Frederick Douglass, knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave. So she knew it was necessary to be educated so that her children can have a greater sense of freedom, and it was a path to freedom. Yet at the same time, in the United States, this path to freedom costs a lot of money, which actually doesn't really free you. So that's what she's talking about here. If you notice, a lot of the healthcare workers, she notes how healthcare workers of a certain acumen have to have a certain amount of degrees to work in the healthcare system. And if you're going to be Black African-American, you're going to have to take out loans to participate in that system, or you'll be on the lower rung of the healthcare system. Again, still kind of stuck in this cyclical sense of enslavement. So this was more for the evacuation. Now, I want to say a thing. The 2 comments, I'll actually go back there, talked about why they needed to stay to transform the system, right? They did mess with the idea of evacuation. I'm kind of getting tired of them. I'm disillusioned. I don't think it'll ever be for us, but we have to stay here. We have to keep trying to fix it. Cubby, I believe in the idea of public education, right? And she's committed to the idea. The other thing is Cubby also worked as a volunteer on a regular basis inside of her grandchildren's school system, like 3 times a week she was there. Okay, so now we get to evacuation. And the interesting thing about my study is my study, by the time I was in the middle of it, COVID hit. So it was its own natural experiment. And I saw a lot of things change in real time very quickly. Right here, you have Carson, who is a public school teacher. She's a public school teacher. And she says, so it is. I don't know if it's possible. I don't think it's possible. I think it would have to be, I mean, not like I don't want to say resegregation, but it's just not how our systems are built. It would take a complete tear down and rebuild further to be, as a school, to be a safe place for Black kids. So Carson is showing her disbelief in the ability of the school system to even change, even though she works as a public school teacher herself. But to her, that's why she knows, because she was like one of very few Black teachers in the school, and anything that had to do with Black or marginalized kids, they put on her. And she was a relatively new teacher, and she had also just given birth to twins. So she had that stress on her as well, plus the work she was doing with ACBM. Shatarla, who was an older grandmother, said, I thank God for COVID shutting down the schools. It gave my son confidence to know he can teach his son himself. Now he can keep my grandbaby out them schools. I'm going to go on to the next one. So I'm really looking to create more, and especially now that this is a great opportunity to do that COVID-19 has presented some additional opportunities for us, because now kids are home with their parents and they are safe. Now we can break down each of these comments and we could talk about a lot of the things that we heard during COVID-19, children not being able to eat, not being able to participate in lunch programs. I've read stories about potential greater chances of abuse inside homes, and they couldn't leave. Before a lot of Black parents, especially the Black mothers I spoke to, they looked at this like, yes, this is hard. Yes, it is hard working and having to teach your children at the same time. But guess what? I know they won't be suspended. Guess what? I know my son won't be seen before a judge because he got caught with a vape pen. I'll put him on punishment. I'll call his daddy. We'll talk to him. We'll work it out. But he's not going to go to jail for this. So these mothers saw this as an opportunity created by COVID-19, where now more people are getting educated about how you go online, how you use Zoom, how you use all these digital tools, how it is you find where all these classroom lesson plans are that you can use to educate your kids to beef up what it is that if they're still in the school system, what it is now, the parents and the mothers, they talked a lot in the interviews, what it is they were able to see. That was my own experience, what I was able to see, what was happening or what wasn't happening. And I was like, how come they're not telling you, oh, you can come with me for that? Like, this is all that's happening. And giving grace, right? Understanding that the schools were learning their way too. But there were just some things that parents realized they don't have to physically be inside the school. So we will leave and we'll evacuate. This mother, Lynn, is one of the founders of ACBM. And she said, I feel like we are holding our babies. We are now playing this game with the school to prison pipeline, and we just want to dismantle it. We want to abolish it. But if we keep bumping our head against the wall, we may just need to leave. And now, because of COVID-19, a lot of these Black mothers are seeing tools laid out before them that they did not have access or did not even know about before COVID-19. I'm not going to spend too much time on here, but you see three things really powering in my research, how it is they determine whether or not they were going to work to transform or evacuate. And this is the thing, they didn't choose either or. It was usually a combination of both. And again, some of that assimilation, right? That accommodation type politics as well. But they have faith in the possibility. And it's the same story of faith that you hear and you see throughout history of Black folks believing in the Constitution and what it is that the Constitution says, and we should live up to our greatest ideas and values that the four founders wrought, but then see that they're not actually doing that, right? Politics of desperation, talking about how it is they don't have any other options, or they didn't believe they had other options. So they can only go to the public school or the charter schools. And if both of them suck, then where are you going to go? Well, now they have this other avenue. Well, we could possibly homeschool more, potentially. We can do school online. Now more online schools are showing up. Again, another conversation, because all of these things, how good are they really for these children? But if you are in a desperate situation, you are going to go to the things you see nearest to you that may possibly be better. And then disappointment and disillusionment. Their history of disappointment and disillusionment with themselves, with their parents, like the mother's parents. A lot of them, when I did oral histories with them, that was their first set of interviews, talked about how their parents were treated in the school system and how their parents' attitudes influenced what their parents did with them. And what you see often is like a greater push towards education. Like, you have to do this. I wasn't allowed to read, or I had to get pulled out of school in 8th grade because I had to work in fields or whatever. So you have to do this thing. But it still left a negative taste because it was like, you don't want us in the school system, right? So in terms of the influence of the organization, how have their efforts influenced education policy and created real change? For this, I talked to a lot of the community members, and they highlighted not just the organization, right, that could be kind of biased, but what do you think their impact has been? And they brought up things like, I know that in my former district, they definitely had an impact because conversations that we have been having at the executive tables, oftentimes we would speak through the lens of things that they have shared. I think they do a good job of highlighting blind spots. So I'm gonna go forward. So having someone there to highlight blind spots, whether malintent or not, is really important. Discussions around discipline and practices and policies as a result of them being at the table, being part of the conversation. I know decisions were made differently. They were healthier decisions. And this is one of the district administrators high up, I'll just say that, very high up, who talked about the influence of ACBM coming to board meetings and the impact that they would have. And so the board members would then have to have conversations speaking through ACBM because they were bringing up things that they hadn't even considered in a particular policy or whatever. This was a board member, one of the board members who would let me speak with them. The Akawi School District allowed them to set up. So when he says that, they allow the mothers to go inside and have a classroom inside of the school and set up like an office to help students. Students could go in there and the mothers will offer them snacks or just sit down and kind of talk with them and help calm them down if they were like, upset or whatever. And that's what the mothers did in this office in the Akawi district. They gave them actual space on campus for their volunteer work. Now, I'm not sure if that was a policy change, but I found it interesting that they were allowed as a group or a group such as ACBM to actually have space on campus to be able to do the work they do. And so I'm not sure if that was be a policy change, but I think that the fact they were able to do that is pretty significant. It's an easy thing to do because it's not an easy thing to do because most school districts would just say no. So these were cited as examples of authentic change, that the schools were approached by ACBM and they say, yes, it would be a good idea. And they supported them in some way, whether it is they were providing space or whatever it was for the mothers to do their work with parents and students. They also work with parents who want to know what their rights were and also may want to have conversations like, Johnny's doing whatever, and I don't know how to bring him in. He's not turning in his homework. And so for them to be able to talk to mothers who they could more closely relate to, especially culturally, ethnically, whatever, made them have a space in the school useful for the mothers in the community, but also for the school, right? Then conciliatory change. Now, Vanessa was a school employee who would hide her attendance at ACBM meetings because she was scared she would be fired if she was ever found out. Okay, all right. Girl, they are rolling their eyes like, what do they want now? What now? What do they want now? They are afraid of them. I think it is this whole issue of value that white folks think we have no value and only they have value. The whole idea that what people of color have to say, period, that white is right, that people of color, we don't know shit. We have nothing of value to say. So the coalition is coming. They are all ready to say, what do they want? Give them what they want, instead of looking at us as partners in this thing called education. I felt like Vanessa's quote absolutely summed up what conciliatory change is, right? It's handing someone off something just so they can be quiet, just so you can say you did it, but really there is nothing internal that is changing. There is nothing long lasting, because if ACBM was to disappear off the planet today, would your policies stay? And we already know the answer. I know the answer because I saw it happen in real time. Right after I got done my dissertation, I saw things crumble very quickly. It's not really going to challenge the system, even when you have equity directors who are, activists, your disruptors. their check is still dependent on, the people in the system leading the system. So going back to Vanessa, who was an employee of the system, who would only hide the fact that she would hide the fact that she was coming to these meetings. This is another board member who was willing to talk to me and talked about how there were conversations, very heated conversations, about the equity director in their district, who had only been there not for very long, and what it is that the board perhaps needs to do to get rid of her, because she was speaking up on the issues that ACBM were bringing up. There has been a lot of conversation, particularly in the district, about how do we tone down the director of equity and inclusion. So we see the two things. So follow me.
You have, we can go until 2:15, but usually we try to leave about 15 minutes for questions.
Okay, I'm going to make this quick. We've all seen the news. So like I said, when I got done with my dissertation, I moved here in a very interesting time with my son. It was the election of Donald Trump as president. And so there were a lot of things happening racially and culturally inside the state of Arizona. My kids kind of had like culture shock, not understanding what was happening and what was going on in the conversations they were hearing inside their classrooms from students who have been also listening to their parents, and some of the things that were happening, like putting up signs over the school that said Black lives don't ever matter, that sort of thing. And my daughter coming back to tell me about it. This was my first year here. So we see that there were culture wars. So when ACBM went to school board meetings, they would get things like the board would agree to make a statement and adopt a statement that ACBM had crafted about the importance of equity and inclusion and how we will fight student push out. And then 6 months later, a group of, I call them counter equity parents under a large umbrella, right? There were different groups, would come and say, how dare you have equity trainings? How dare you talk about anti-bias? How dare you talk about anti-Blackness? And in those board meetings, the school boards would reverse course on the things that they had just adopted when ACBM was in front of them. And we see the things that we see now. So in Arizona, again, even though we have a new governor, there are still the remnants of what the governor was able to put in place before he left. So I'm still waiting to see if any of those things will be reversed with our superintendent of education and how those things will move forward. We see what's going on in Florida, but the thing I really want you to take from Florida is not just the denial of African-American studies in their AP courses, but how they built up to this, right? It didn't just happen, like we kind of saw it. In Arizona, we kind of saw it when I first moved here in 2016. You all were fighting and pushing back against the ethnic studies ban, and that was lost. But what they did is they took notes so they could come back stronger. That wasn't the end of that. And Derek Bell, who most people don't know, even though we all talk about anti-CRT so much, who's one of the creators of CRT, talks often about interest convergence and the permanence of racism. In other words, that fighting back against injustice is going to be a never-ending battle. And oftentimes where you see people coming together is only when their interests align. So as long as ACBM was in front of school boards and the news was there and that sort of thing, it sounds good to read the statement saying that you think that equity and inclusion matter. But then when they leave, and another group of parents come in and say, no, we don't want this, you're making my kid feel guilty, then they reverse course. And so, of course, how do we think that Black parents are going to respond to these things? We see a rise in homeschooling. I myself homeschooled my son. And again, people like to separate these strands, and I don't. Even when I talk about, accommodation, evacuation, and transformation, they are not three separate entities. They happen interchangeably and intermingling with each other. I believe in the potential of public schools. I believe in the idea, just like I believe in the preamble of the Constitution. But unfortunately, that is not what has happened So what do you expect these parents to do? The title of this talk is, Where Do We Go From Here? Where Do We Go From Here is the last book written from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who is still on my mind. His birthday just passed, and we celebrated his birthday. He is one of my greatest models and icons, spoke fearlessly, but he wrote this book on an island for 2 months, did the first draft of the book without a telephone. He said, don't hook up telephones. It was the longest time he had ever had to himself to sit and write, and he wrote the first draft of this book. 10 months later, he was murdered. So he didn't even actually see the book published. In the book, you see a man who is torn about what has happened, and it's really taking account of what the civil rights movement was able to accomplish and where it is it needs to go. He did give a nod to Black nationalism and these other things that people consider far more radical, saying that they were useful, but he feared that they would not be the right path. But he also doubted his own path because he had been let down and he was not sure if this was going to go the way he wanted it to go, that all of the things that had happened had been relatively conciliatory. In one of his talks, he spoke about how it didn't cost anything to have laws put on the books. But then when you start asking for people to actually make real change that might actually cost them something, there's pushback against that. Dr. King said in the book, he said, overwhelmingly, America is still struggling with irresolution and contradictions. It has been sincere and even ardent in welcoming some change, but too quickly, apathy and disinterest arise on the surface when the next logical steps are to be taken. He said that in the book. Harry Belafonte came to Flint, Michigan, my hometown, in 2007, and he told the story that a lot of people, if they've paid attention to like social rights movements or whatever, I want to say it's folklore, but it's not. It's kind of like a big deal story. He talks about how one of his last time seeing Martin Luther King seemed very bothered and distraught. And Harry Belafonte said, "What's the problem? What's wrong?" And MLK gave the comment is, "I fear that we are integrating into a burning house." His fear was that even just through this idea of integration, if there is no systemic change in the hearts of the country, that it will not do anything, not only for Black folks, but for poor people, right? And again, in his last book, you see him expanding to say, we need to talk about injustices of everyone, of all human beings. And what will be the purpose of all of this work that I've done? And so Harry Belafonte said, well, then what should we do? Harry Belafonte was taken apart aback because he said, I'd never really seen King so beaten. He seemed very beaten. But we know now, like in the last year or so of his life, he was very tired. He was very frustrated and he wasn't sure. And I think it shows up in the book, Where Do We Go From Here? And King said, we become the firemen. That's what he said. We become the firemen. And so that comment made me think about the work of the mothers who were trying to be firemen. And I think we really need to think about all of the jobs that firemen really do. It's not just about putting out the fire, right? It's about going in the house, saving lives when they're in there, bringing them out, that someone else comes, puts air on them, make sure that they're okay, calls the ambulance. Meanwhile, you're still trying to put out the fire, you're moving people out the way, so if the structure falls, it doesn't hurt anyone else. Firemen do a lot. And so people like MLK, people like the ACBM organization, other people who are fighting systems of injustice and inequity inside our school system are the firemen. But guess what? They're tired. They're tired. And if they see another way, who are we to judge if that other way is valid or not? I heard a lot of people saying, how can this organization support things like micro schools? Because by the end, they were supporting those things. How can they support just online schools? Because they had been exposed to that during COVID and saw the possibility. I say that as people in education, that we need to ask a deeper question and ask why not, and then create the circumstances so that they don't have to do those things. Because at the end of the day, like I said at the beginning, my ability to homeschool my son is something that is not available to all mothers I have privilege in a myriad of ways. Yes, I'm a Black woman. Yes, I'm sometimes disabled. Yes, I'm a single mother, but I'm highly educated. I make a decent living. I have access to resources that most people don't have access to. So if I want this system to work for the lion's share of us, how can we be better firemen? And sometimes part of that is rebuilding the house. Excuse me. Justice is not a whisper in a storm praying that someone notices. It is a thunderclap that lets you know it is here and it will be heard. Justice is not tiptoe through quicksand, hoping it can grasp a branch to pull itself through. It is a marching band working together to see everyone makes it to the other side. At the end of King's book, Where Do We Go From Here? He notes, the United States is far from providing each child with as much education as they can use. Our school system still functions primarily as a system of exclusion. For the oldest generation of Negroes, the time for effective educational remedies is probably already past. But there is an enormous reservoir of talent and among the Negro and other poor youth. This society has to develop that talent. The unrealized capacities of many of our youth is an indictment to our society's lack of concern for justice and its proclivity for wasting human resources. As with so much else in this potential of great society, injustice and waste, unfortunately, go together and endanger stability. So we are now faced with how are we as educators, how are we as researchers in whatever realm going to be the firemen, and what role can we play in putting out the fire? Thank you very much for listening to me.
I have questions here. I can step over if you want. I can see and moderate here so you can focus on our audience.
Okay, can I sit down? I'll be able to see it. Thank you.
You gave us so much to think about. I think everyone is really thinking. It's just a combination of both thought-provoking and inspirational on so many levels. So thank you.
I have a question. So the ACBM, is that like a national organization? You might have mentioned it in your.
No, they were a local grassroots organization. They were local.
Do they have plan? Because I think that support is so important, especially if when Black mothers or Black children experience this level of discrimination where they're automatically for their first offense put into the criminal justice system. When it's one mother saying this isn't right versus 5, 6, 7, 20 mothers saying this isn't right, then there's a level of defense for that child. And that pipeline is sort of messed up or like dismantled. And I'm curious if there's any sort of movement to create these sort of support systems within the public school system so there isn't an evacuation of Black children from the public school system.
Okay, so that's really a big question because you have the piece of the ability of these organizations to connect with each other and then what support they're receiving, where they're receive it from. So I'll start from that question first. Unfortunately, a lot of the schools did not support the work of ACBM financially, materially, or otherwise. So they had to reach out to the community and other individuals to get support so they could continue their work. Because like I said, the average age is 52. You had retired mothers, you had grandmothers, and you had younger mothers. I mean, I guess I'm younger, I don't know, but even younger than me, like in their 20s, working with ACBM, having to pull away from their families or whatever to go to the meetings that were 2 times a month and then volunteer for all the stuff that had to happen and then go to board meetings. So they had to schedule who's going to go to what board meeting. So we'll always have someone there. So there's that piece. So unfortunately they have been able to, ACBM still exists. They have been able to do some grassroots fundraising. They've gotten some grants, things of that nature. And in a way, them having some retired mothers has been a benefit to them because they have more time than some of the younger mothers who still have children inside the school system and everything, who have to go to work every day. And that sort of a situation. In terms of a network, I think in community organizing in general, It's hard to create a network. Again, that could be a whole nother talk. I would love to go talk to you about community organizing, but unfortunately, and even historically, it is hard for organizations to work together because oftentimes they may not be aligned in terms of their interests or how it is they determine to move forward. So when I talked about the three approaches, you will have an organization that I would probably identify as more about accommodation. And those are the type of organizations who we've all seen that are like, how do we prepare students to be college ready? Now, we all want kids to be college ready or not. I still believe in the power of college. Obviously, I went through it. But it's really about preparing them to fit inside of the cog, right? It's not about how do we empower schools to better prepare the students themselves and to reach out to where the students, are most passionate. So that would be like an accommodationist type of an organization. They're going to run counter to an organization that is like ACBM, that's about transformation. They want to change the system. They want to change policies. They want to have an impact on that. Who also run counter with the organization who has central tenets about evacuation. We're leaving, we're out of here, that people identify in terms with historically with Black nationalism. But again, there's reasons for that, right? To say, why are we still wasting our time here? This is stupid. Let's put our energy into doing this new thing. So ACBM kind of dipping it into all three is problematic for some people. It's hard for them to wrap their minds around what it is they do. Like they should only be focused on one. And their position really is we can't be focused on one. And I would agree. I don't think that people who have been marginalized can only be focused on one approach. And I think by the end of King's life, bringing it back to him, I think he realized that. I think you see some of that as well. When people talk about his nonviolent approach, it was a strategy. It was not meant to be the whole entire kit and caboodle. And he was coming to that. So how it is that you get organizations to work together, has just been hard. You would think it would be easier now because of social media and ways for us to do that, but just not yet.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Couple of questions. One, are you aware of any similar grassroots organizing here in Tucson?
So in Tucson, I am not. I've only been here a year.
Okay.
But in terms of being focused, so my original idea for my dissertation was actually going to focus on the ACLU. And the ACLU is how I actually met ACBM. And then it so happened after I met them initially, then we also, one of the founders was presenting at a conference that I also was presenting at. And then that's how we linked up, and then the rest is history. But ACLU has an arm that looks at student exclusion in the school. They have an education arm. I would assume that the branch here also has some associated arm. And I know that they had national calls about student exclusion in school to prison pipeline through the ACLU. But anywhere else that I know that's doing their work here, I do not.
Okay. And then the follow-up to that was, do you feel that community-based organizations, if they had supported more of the grassroots approach, like that kind of two-pronged approach, how do you envision that playing out?
Right. So people ask me this all the time. and I can't say exactly how it'll play out. I didn't get to that, but I think that schools of education and colleges have a responsibility to support these type of organizations. Even if it's just through, it's not just, I'm not gonna say that because then they'll only do that and it'll be that kind of conciliatory type thing. But first level is space, right? Space to meet, space to have community organizations come through. There are researchers here at U of A, at other colleges who specialize in organizing, who specialize in policy change, who talk about policy theory. And through things like YPAR, Youth Participatory Action Research, or Community Power, Community Participatory Action Research, we can help to empower the community. I would like to see colleges, especially I'm from the School of Education, especially schools of education, more invested in that and not just looking at it as like this, well, are these people gonna come to our school? But no, it's a long game. It's a long game. So you invest in the community because maybe not right now, but in 20 years, those parents are gonna say, you know what? we had a good relationship with U of A. And I remember them, that's a good school. Yes, I want you to apply to go there. Yes, you're gonna go there. I think that's how you can build up things. I think it comes down to what can the public educational system be? How much will it actually change? I have a fear. This is my nightmare scenario, or maybe it's not. Segregation, ideas of segregation have come back up in Black and white circles. And Black folks talk about it insofar as how has integration helped us? And it has not helped us. It has taken away a lot of the doctors, the teachers, the other resources that we had. When you look at Brown v. Board and what happened to Black teachers and Black principals, post Brown v. Board, they were fired. They were replaced with white teachers and white educators, which is why we have what we have now. So you have that piece. And then I just kind of imagine like what would happen if all the Black parents or brown parents or parents of color who could have the ability to leave and worked with community organizations left. I feel like you will always have a contingent of students that can't and will be stuck in the public school system without the resources they need. That's one situation. Or you will have a total flip where I think you could see white parents going back to public schools because they say all the Black and brown kids are gone. So let's go back. And so now they have, then they start changing policy to shift funds to go back into public education. And now they have it. And now you have all these marginalized groups doing their grassroots stuff, but not having the same type of resources that they have. So it's still segregation, right? In the way the Brown v. Board imagined it. So I can't read the writing on the wall and say what would happen. I just wish schools of education and researchers were more involved.
We are, looks like we're at 2:15. And what are the other questions? Thank you. Thank you so much for this. It's just, I hope it is the beginning of conversations. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.